Hey everybody, welcome back to Mondays with Mooch. Today's a real special one for me. We had Frank on Patched Season 3, and him and I have known each other for a long time. And a lot of you that read my book or know my story know I came up from the skinhead scene. And Frank was one of the pioneers of that scene in Los Angeles. His family were notorious in the motorcycle world for a long time. And so our paths have crossed numerous times. And I'm really happy to get on here. And we're going to share some pretty heavy stuff today. So I appreciate you coming on today, Frank.
Thanks for having me, Mooch.
And, we were kind of talking a little bit off air about, what's brought us together over these years, and our shared experiences, one, but then both of our work in the mental health field. So you want to talk just a little bit background about what you do for the mental health stuff?
So my wife and I are big in the mental health community. We have a nonprofit called We Are Those People, which is a recovery-based mental health advocacy group. We do a lot of work with the AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and various different, recovery centers. My wife has a bachelor's in, addiction services, and she got her master's degree in nonprofit administration. And we, help people get sober. We're both in recovery. We have 10 years sober, and we have a huge platform on social media that really kind of blew up in the pandemic, when people couldn't go to meetings and mental health was at an all-time low. And, I'm a tattoo artist, I've been tattooing for over 35 years, and it's become a big part of our life, that we're just trying to help people live healthier lives and get away from, the bad stuff,
Yeah. I love that. And I think from what I know of your story, a lot of what's brought you there is, the way you were brought up and the things you've gone through in life. And, when we started Patched, our initial goal, we really wanted to show everyone, and the same reason I've had like Hell's Angels and other people on Mondays with Mooch here, is that we want to show everyone that a lot of us have a lot of things in common. And, talking about the war between the Mongols and the Angels, and a lot of people that, as we've learned recently, don't know how it started. There's this myth that the Mongols weren't allowed into the Angels for being Hispanic. There's the stuff about the bottom rocker, but the real stories never really come out. And up until we had George Christie on Patched podcast, when he started kind of talking more about it, your name came up and some other people in your family's names came up, and it really got me intrigued on the story. And so I know for you, it's kind of been new to share it too. So you kind of want to talk about what brought us to come to share your story?
Well, like when I first met you, Mooch, you were prospecting, or you were a member of the Vagos, and I was riding with a Christian motorcycle club. And what was that, like the early 2000s?
Yeah, 2004, 2005.
Yeah, and so even back then, I was already on a path of like, I've been through the grinder with, the Outlaw Motorcycle Club and gang life and drugs, and I'm just trying to help people get better. So I'm still on that page, and I've had some ups and downs, but growing up the way I grew up and the experiences I had, I was kind of privy to a lot of, top secret inside information about how those organizations came to be, how they operated, and what like the real story was, right? And a lot of my family's history were secret until George Christie, was put out bad by the Hells Angels, and he decided to go public with a lot of stuff. And like I was sharing with you earlier, there were even things that I would share with my children, and they wouldn't necessarily believe me until they saw it on TV,
Right.
What like I shared with you earlier, things that would even like trip me out was like watching Sons of Anarchy, It's like, okay, Sons of Anarchy were the Hells Angels, and the Mayans were supposed to be the Mongols, and they were warring. Why were they warring? There was a part in the show where they kidnapped a baby, And I'd be like, damn, that's like my family story, That's like weird, because these things get passed down through generations and they become like folk tales.
Absolutely.
But there's a little bit of truth to every story, right? And so it's always been kind of, I don't know if it was the reason I struggled with addiction. I'm sure it was. It was really traumatic stuff to go through as a kid, but it definitely played a part,
One of the things I wanted to ask is, since this was a secret for so long, what was it like, carrying this family secret for so long? Like, how do you feel like it impacted you?
Well, in a lot of ways, I feel like, I was denied my own. It's like I was denied my own ownership over my own feelings and emotions, because my relationship with my father was so delicate that I wouldn't want to do anything to, damage it, any more than it already was. I didn't want to upset him. And back then, I'm not saying that the scene is like weak sauce now, but back then it was very dangerous, right?
Right.
If somebody found out, there were times when I was places and I wouldn't want them to know who my father was. It wasn't always something to be proud of or something you'd want people to know about, that your dad was a Hell's Angel or an ex-Hell's Angel, or that your family started a biker war, or,
Absolutely.
And I was really confused about a lot of it, how to feel about a lot of it,
And when it's something that's a secret, who do you talk to, right? Like, how do you share what you're going through with anybody? Or did you have anyone you can share with?
Man, it's really interesting because I'm working with Rod Esputo right now, who was the first guy to ever take me to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting at Impact in Pasadena, like 35 years ago. And his sponsor is Don Ferris. He was a high-ranking, high-respected Mongol. And I went through Impact with Don, and even to today, there's just a lot that it's hard to talk with somebody who would understand,
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like, some regular therapist isn't going to get it.
For sure. It's one of those things I've said too, like, I'm a therapist, but I wouldn't feel comfortable doing therapy with a veteran that saw combat, because, I could empathize with them, but I don't know that shared experience, right? I could hear where they're coming from, but it'd be hard for me because I can't equate to that. And I feel like if you come from gang life or biker life or whatever, some therapists might be able to pick up on it, but in the mainstream, right, it's hard to feel like, oh, they're going to grasp what I'm saying, or we're not going to get judged for saying these types of things. So so was it within the NA community when you found like that you could share more things, or when did that start happening?
Well, Narcotics Anonymous was anonymous. A lot of it. AA is a little bit different than NA. I remember the first meeting at NA, I looked around and there were like these guys, and they had that hard prison. You hold the tension in your shoulders. It's you can tell someone's been to prison. They're hard, and they had these little single needle tattoos on their neck. And I was like, yeah. Whoa, like these guys look like me, and that's because Narcotics Anonymous, there's more of a criminal element because drugs were illegal. But in AA, alcohol is legal, so it would be a little bit more normalized,
That makes sense.
But yeah, like in NA, there's a lot of prison gang culture. Like I shared before, like you'd see a lot of Mongols and Bogos in NA meetings,
Yeah.
I wouldn't see in LA, I wouldn't see as many HAs, but maybe like out, in the valley, SFV, yeah. But you don't really talk too much about that stuff because you didn't trust, people. So I had a therapist once that he broke it down to me when explain to him like what happened, because when my mother left my father, she said she left him because he hit her and he hit me and she caught him cheating. And then like she like dropped me off with her parents, and they were kind of raising me like my mother was my sister. So I thought my grandfather was my father. And then one day her and Bud just showed up and just grabbed me. And she told me Bud was my father. So I had to be like 4 years old at that point, and it's like my identity had been changed 3 times. And he said that that was the key to what was kind of like my biggest struggle was, you know what I mean? Like they trying to develop, right? As a child,
Yeah.
and you don't know who you really are, you know?
Absolutely.
And, you know, so they basically kidnapped me, and then the Hell's Angel Mongol War was exploding really bad, and they took off to Oklahoma. And, you know, from my mother's side of the story, she'd say that they were in love, you know, and that they were getting away from my dad. He was the bad guy, you know, the Hell's Angels were the bad guys. And it was and like Bud was going to love me more than my own father type thing. And they changed my name. And I would think, I don't think so. I don't think this guy's my dad, you know? But I went along with it, you know, and we went all the way to Oklahoma, and she was like a stripper, and I like remember like hanging out in strip bars all the time, like in the back room, and you know, it was pretty gnarly. Bud had this big swastika tattoo on his hand, you know, and he was like 6'2". Like my dad was 6'4". They were tall men, you know, long hair, you know, they were pretty tough Vietnam vet guys. Like for a little kid, they were super intimidating, you know.
I bet.
And I remember seeing the patches, and it was pretty gnarly. And then like one time I woke up on my mother's, you know, she was laying in a pool of her own dried blood, you know, and I like had to wake her up, you know, and she got up and she went in the mirror and her like jaw was broke, you know, and you know, her and Bud would get in some pretty gnarly fights, you know. Pretty gnarly fights. And I remember Bud would hide guns around the house and tell me not to tell my mom where they were because he thought she was going to shoot him or something. You know, I don't know.
Did you see that same type of stuff with between your biological dad and mom, or were you too young to remember?
I think I do remember the last memory when she said that he slapped me off the bed and he hit her. And I remember she put me in the passenger seat floor. And I remember like looking up at her, and she was, you know, crying. And I remember that being like a really like explosive situation. And, I remember there were times when my father would come visit me at my grandparents' house, and he would show up and he would just look so out of place, and he would be really upset, and he would leave, you know.
So both of the father figures you had at the time were abusive to your mother. When did you think that was like the norm? Like that's just how relationships went? Like when did you really kind of look into that, or did that catch up?
It's funny because I was at a tattoo convention in Houston this weekend, and I was, you know, next to my booth was next to Tattoo Magazine at the request of Billy Tinney, who runs Tattoo Magazine now, that my father owns. He owns Easy Riders and Tattoo Magazine. And there was a lady, Annette LaRue from New Orleans, and she was like, "Oh, what was it like growing up with your father, the owner of Easy Rider? It must have been a cool childhood." She's like, "Did you guys ride bikes and dirt bikes?" And I'm like, "I've never rode a dirt bike in my life. Never. I've only rode Harley Davidsons on the street. I don't know nothing about going camping and taking dirt bikes out in the desert. I never did none of that. And my childhood was not fun." Like I can tell you that point blank, you know, it was not a fun, you know, experience. And I never really understood, like, I didn't know any different, right? So, like, back then, the bikers were always naked. Like, they were partying naked. The women were always naked. I grew up, they were going to photo shoots with naked women on choppers for Easy Riders. My mom dancing naked on stage around all these biker parties. Like, when I would wake up every morning, my parents would be naked. They were hippies, walking around, And I didn't know any of that was wrong or different. I don't even know if it is wrong, but I mean, until later on in life, when my mother left Bud and went back to Los Angeles, and then my grandparents sent me to a Christian school in, oh man, I want to say Long Beach or like Seal Beach, Los Alamitos, and they started kind of like laying the religious trip on me, And then I was like, oh, like, that's not normal,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because there was like, everything was like G-rated. Like, they try to like shelter you, and how can you do that to someone who's already been exposed to so much? And I was like, man, this is really strange, I didn't know how to feel about that,
Yeah, one of the things we talked about before is what's common in kids that grow up in abusive households, or if they're abused or whatever. There's a socioeconomic status. There's a lot of things that go into it, right? But it's normally not the type of kid that's staying the night at other kids' houses and seeing how other families interact, right? So a lot of times they feel like this is normal until, like you said, then you have this experience where you find out that it's not. Do you feel like that was similar for you? Like, were you going to other people's houses? Were you seeing how other families interact, and were like, that's not what it's like at home?
Yeah, a lot, man. A lot, and I was bummed a lot of my childhood. And like, I can remember it's really interesting how it lays out a path to, joining the skinhead youth of the 80s and 90s, because like, it was so violent, the 80s, the 70s and 80s, being around the one percenter life and all that. And I would definitely feel out of place around a regular family. I could, like, my name, they changed my name to Graham. So I had the name Graham all the way up to like junior high. And there was even a time after we'd returned back to California from Los Angeles, and after Bud had been ran off the road and was in a wheelchair, and my dad, he had, my dad was well off. He was very successful, but my mother was extremely poor, and I would feel really out of place, right, when my dad would take me to visit his parents, and I would think like, man, you had such a good childhood, like, why am I having to go through what I'm going through,
Right.
And, but my dad would blame it on my mother. It's her fault. She ran off with you, and now your life is like this because it's hers, And, so I wanted to tell this one story, like, I was like going to have a spring break, and my mother said, okay, you can either go visit Keith, and he's going to be on his boat in the Ventura Marina, because he had boats, he had Corvettes, he had yachts, boats, houses, and he's going to be on the boat for a week. And I was very intimidated by my father. We never had a relationship where we like hugged each other or wrestled or played catch. It was just like a very intimidating relationship. And I did actually have some warm memories of Bud. That's who I, kind of bonded with. And she said, oh, so you can go spend a week on a boat with Bud, with Keith, right, in Ventura, or you can go visit Bud in Oklahoma. I chose to go see Bud.
Wow.
And I can tell you I regretted it immediately when I got off the plane, because I was met by his girlfriend with two black eyes.
No.
And she was a thin, cute little thing with long, stringy hair. And I remember getting in there, and I was always like this companion to these abused women. So, it's crazy, all these hipsters and the chopper, and they like to dress 70s. And I'm like, I like to see you live through that shit. You know what I mean? It was not hipster,
Yeah, for
sure. Women were treated like property. Children were dismissed, And anyway, I remember I was in the car with her, and she goes, well, people say to me, how do you let him hit you? He's in a wheelchair. And I tell him he's got really long arms. It was like, oh my God, like, what have I done? I should have went to I should have went to Ventura, right? But it was good to see Bud, and he at the time had this like contraption that he would get on to keep circulation in his legs. So every day he'd have to get on this thing, and I'd have to help him, and it would move his legs so his legs wouldn't go dead or whatever. And I think at the time he was hoping he'd get feeling back in his legs, and he'd have his catheter and his pee bag, and it wasn't glamorous, bro.
I bet.
To choose to go see Bud in Oklahoma, overseeing my rock star Easy Riders, dad
on a boat.
Yeah,
right?
And he took me to gun shows, and he bought me a blow dart, thing, and he taught me about guns, and we went to the shooting range, and then we went back and put the ammo together. Bud was a killer, man. That guy was a killer, and he was a badass. Like Bud and his brother Chester were so intimidating. 6'4". I had a picture of me and Bud at Disneyland, and they just look like monsters, Yeah. And and he was that was the deal, guns, and they were extremely racist, swastika tattoos, and Bud told me that it meant a lot to him that he knew that I had the choice to go see Keith or come see him, it was a trip, man. That was the last time I went, though. I didn't do that again.
But when it came to connections with the two of them, you felt at the time more of a connection with Bud than with Keith? Like as far as like who was more of a father figure, so to speak?
Yeah, I don't know, man. Like I said, I think I was really confused.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Because now looking back, now I'm not saying the reason that they took me to Oklahoma, but let's think about it, Mooch. You got the Angels blowing them up and shooting them, and you're the two main guys, Bud and Chester. You're the main targets, right? So they're blowing up and shooting everybody, blowing up funerals, blowing up George, killing kids,
Yeah.
And what if we kidnapped a angel kid and wore him like a life vest? You know what I mean? They're not going to blow up the car. Yeah. They got the Hell's Angel kid in there. They're not going to shoot up the house. There's a Hell's Angel kid in there. And so my mother would tell a story that always made my dad in the negative light. And she told those stories to my daughters and people. And, my mother passed away now, and she's not here to defend herself. So I'm not going to say anything bad about this. Is just what she told me. And she was very upset. Her and my sister, I have a half brother and a half sister from, so growing up, I had a Hell's Angel dad and a half brother and sister whose dad was a Mongol, they were very upset. They even wrote George and gave George a bunch of that my mother was very young. She was, she had me when she was barely a week to be 18, so she was really young. She made a lot of bad choices. My dad was 27 years old, he had a college education. He did 2 tours in Vietnam. He was a full-grown man, and he put a very young woman in very dangerous situation. And you know what I mean? So to blame it on my
Right.
mom, I'm not really, she has a part to play, but I don't know if you could really, you know?
Yeah,
You know what
absolutely.
I mean? And they'll say things were different back then, but in today's time, it would not be okay for a man of his age to be with a girl so young. So when the thing came out public, they didn't name my father. They just referred to him as a Hell's Angel, but they named Karen and Bud and Chester. And the other part, you know, of the story, as you know, is that Chester was labeled a rat.
Yeah.
And the story I was told growing up was that he didn't rat, that he talked to Sonny Barger, and back then Sonny was just like such a, you know, he always was, you know, like the puppet master. And what's interesting is that Chester and George Christie, two big figures in my life. George is like my godfather, and he was even featured in Easy Riders when my mother and my dad made some makeshift garage union. And my dad brought George around the club, but George was, you know, always known. George Christie's my godfather, you know. But they both had a story that Sonny Barger put them out bad and did them dirty. That's all I know. You know, that these two enigmatic figures in my life both had this story that Sonny did them dirty. Sonny told Chester to cooperate with law enforcement because it wasn't his fault that the guy died from the LSD and they threw him in the well.
Yeah. Two guys, right? There was two guys in the well.
And it wasn't his fault. So why should he have to go to prison for life? And it was an accident. And under those conditions, Sonny told him to cooperate. And then when he did, he put a rat jacket on him and put him out bad.
Yeah. And what a lot of people may not know is this was at George Weathern's ranch, right? Who also cooperated with law enforcement after he was busted. But, you know, this was an era pre-internet, right? Like, someone could go from one state to another and kind of restart, right? And so at least the story was told to me is that then Chester then moved to Los Angeles area, right? And then him and Bud started their own club and then eventually patched over to Mongols. So what people may miss here is that Chester was a former Hell's Angel. The story was that he had ratted on people. Whether he did or not is up to debate. But now he's on the other side, right? This is before they're enemies, but he was in this other team, so to speak, right? Is that kind of accurate, or that's what you've been told as well?
Yeah. And they would say that Chester roped Bud into it because it was his younger brother. And Chester and Bud actually had different dads. So Chester was Chester Green, but Bud was Bud. Dixon Graham was his name, Dixon Graham. And, you know, a club can say whatever they want about you.
Yeah, we know that for sure, right?
They are not, they're very corrupt systems, right? Like, you know, they're not, like, they're like cults, you know what I mean? And like, just because the Hells Angels say you're no good, or the Mongols say you're no good, that means you're no good with them. But unless there's paperwork proving that you did these things, you're still good on the street. You're still good in prison, as long as your paperwork's good, right?
Yep.
So that's been the other side of life for me, was learning, you know, the part that prison gangs play in the Outlaw Motorcycle Club and in the streets, you know?
Which changed the whole culture, really, right? Like when the Angels back when they started going out of prison, as you know, they get a little older, I would say that it changed the culture a lot. Because then these guys are getting out of prison, back on the streets, and then they're kind of running the chapters or whatever, like they had learned in prison.
Well, one of my sponsors was in the early riders, and he was one of the first members of Narcotics Anonymous with Danny Trejo. And, those guys will tell you what it was like growing up in the 50s and the 60s, going into juvenile hall, the group homes. And that's when, the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood were first started. And they all knew each other, right? So then all the guys that were getting out of the clubs and starting the outlaw motorcycle clubs, well, most of those guys had been in juvenile hall together in Los Angeles. You know what I'm saying? So they all knew each other. So when people started moving to California to have their hippie experience and their California dream in the 70s and the drug, there would be guys, right? You don't know where they're from. You don't know who they are. And then like they take on a name, right? They call you Country. They call you Rooster or whatever it is. But it's like, who really knows you? You've got this, club name. And if you were a really good outlaw, you'd keep your real identity a secret.
Right.
Back then, the club would take the pink slip to your bike, right? And keep it in the clubhouse, like they had some leverage over you. That was like the other thing that the story was when Chester was put out bad by the Hells Angels, he's in jail. Bud went and broke into the clubhouse and stole his pink slip back. Did you hear that one?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, that was a good story.
It is.
So like already Bud had his brother's back, right? And they're like, these guys, Yeah. It's kind of a cool story, whether you like them or not, or have feelings about it, and that was even like what I had said in my Instagram post. I know the guys from Daly City and my dad, and, Chester was a rat, and that's his jacket, and that's how they looked at it, and people hated him. But to me, that was my stepdad, and that was my uncle, and I, at a time, believed that they were my family, and then later on, I found out they weren't my family, and they had maybe even exploited me, for protection. There was even this one time that, and at this point, I did think that Bud was my father. They were having some Mongol party, and I remember most of them seemed Hispanic, and they pulled me out in the backyard. They were having a party, and they had a big barbecue, and they poured barbecue sauce on me. They took off my shirt, and they poured barbecue, and they held me over the barbecue, and they were having a big laugh. They said, "Here's your Hell's Angel kid. Come get your Hell's Angel kid." And they were spraying me with beer. And my mom came out screaming, "The you guys doing? Give me my son." And I remember thinking to myself, I don't think this guy's my dad.
Right. That's one way to find out.
I had this feeling like, man, my life has taken a really bad turn. I remember thinking like something felt very unsafe, and I just felt like bad things were to come. And she took me and she put me in the bed. This time the barbecue sauce like dried to my skin. It was real itchy. And then these guys started fighting. And back then, people may or may not know, like guys would fist fight in their own club, right? They fought. They get drunk as and they do crazy drugs, and they'd fight each other, They didn't fighting other clubs. They're fighting each other, And these guys start beating each other up. And then my mom's racing me. So they were pretty by the time they did the barbecue sauce thing, But she ran me to the bed, and she put me in the bathtub, and she started running the water so that I could soak in the water so the stuff would come off. And then she went back out there, and I heard bottles breaking, and they were just fighting all over the house. And I remember sitting there going, and like, what the And I was just like trying to get the stuff off my skin. And I finally got out, and I remember this because my mom said, "You can climb on the furniture, mijo. There's glass all over the broken floor." And my mother, the story was that she was Native American. She had long, dark brown hair. She looked Hispanic. She looked, native. She definitely did, and so growing up with the Mongols, even though like Bud and them were super Aryan racist, it was just very Hispanic, And I would think that my mother was Mexican just because of our surroundings always, but she wasn't Mexican. And then later in life, I thought I was Mexican, uh, just because of my surroundings and the culture I was growing up in. But yeah, that was like I would always hear that Hell's Angel child. Come get. He's a Hell's Angel child, and it was like, oh yeah, well, damn, come get him. You know what I mean? It was like a really ugly thing, and it was like,
yeah.
Then I would always hear, the only thing I knew about my dad was he was a Hell's Angel. That's all I knew. You know what I mean? I didn't know until I was like, 8-ish, 9-ish. My mom pulled out a photo album and she said, you remember and there were photos of my dad and they would tell me, oh, and I knew that I would know, I knew that there was something else, but she would tell me that's just some family friend. And then she tells me, this is your dad. This is your real dad. And he's coming to see you. He wants to see you. And I remember meeting him in Long Beach. We were living in an apartment. And I remember he seemed really nervous and he was tall. He had the hipster chopper look, long beard, long hair. And I was like, oh, whoa, he had blonde hair. My dad had blonde, long hair. And I was like, whoa, this is my dad. And then he took me to meet my grandparents. And that was a very different atmosphere than the one I was growing up in, and they lived in Naples, Long Beach.
So for the people that haven't heard, some of George's interviews and some of the story. So, the people that do know some of this history is that the first essential battle between the Mongols and the Angels that really kicked things off was at this swap meet, right? And the story that was told, or at least the story I was told, is that it started because Keith hit Bud, right? And then the big thing kicked off. And then after that, the war kicked off, right? It was go back and forth. And like you said, it escalated to shootings and bombings. Is that the way you remember? I mean, you weren't there for it, but is that like the story you were told? And does that seem accurate?
Again, what's interesting is the way my mother would tell it was, it's kind of up too, because they would always paint my father in a bad light.
Right.
And even after they basically kidnapped me and Bud had her stripping in strip bars and broke her jaw. And, they would still act like Bud was a better guy than Keith. And
just saying a lot, right? As a kid, seeing that's
yeah. And then like they would act like as if Bud could have took my dad, but my dad was a lot taller than Bud. And, he'd been in Vietnam twice, and I can tell you my dad is a lot he's a lot colder. And I'm not trying to say that my dad was a stone cold killer, but he didn't make it as far in life as my father's extremely successful.
Yeah.
Bud was not, in the end,
Yeah. There's an intelligence level to that, right?
Yeah. And I would say that my father is a much more calculative man, and my father would say that he really didn't give a what Bud and Karen did. It wasn't my dad's beef, but it was old man Jack that ran Laco. So, my dad and George and I think one other guy are the last living members of that Laco chapter. Which soon after, I know a few guys in SFE rock some Laco rockers, but there wasn't no Laco chapter that could survive in Los Angeles against the thousands of Mongols,
Right.
And my dad's story is that it was really, it was the shot caller of Laco, It It was Jack's
Which
beef.
I think
Jack
George
was
kind
like,
of
"You're not
alludes to
going to
that a little bit.
disrespect an HA," and they had a beef with Chester. It was more about Chester than Bud. It's like they made Chester and Bud the same guy, you know?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I think and Bud and Chester were just fearless, you know, that they were willing to start such a, you know,
Yeah, absolutely.
you know, and like they knew what they were doing, you know, they knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
My mother knew what they were doing. My mother knew she could say, you know, but she knew she was out to hurt my dad and hurt me. My mother put me in a terrible position, you know.
Did she choose Bud knowing that a Mongol, like knowing that would hurt your dad, or did that because they weren't really at beef yet, right? So was that more a coincidence because she was just in that circle?
Well, see, that's what I want to say. Like, you know how those old biker chicks were, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So she was
in
the circle.
You ever heard of one of those old biker 1%er, like, that punk, you know? They smoke cigarette, you know? You're like, whoa, like these broads are like worse than the dudes, you know?
Yeah.
He's a punk, him, and we're gonna have a big laugh at my dad's expense, at my expense, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know, you know? I don't think anyone at that time knew how deadly serious that situation was going to become, you know?
Yeah, I can't imagine, right? I mean, I see it as potentially from outsider's perspective, someone like Bud and his brother, these guys were hating on them, right? So they're F you, we do what we want. There's that biker mentality, right? Of like, you're not going to intimidate us. The other side is, oh, like, they're not going to disrespect us like that. And then ego hits and it's the fan. And the reason that I think that hearing more of the story is important is because there's so many people involved to this day in that war that have no idea how it started, that have no idea why the two clubs don't get along. And it's perpetrated by all these weird stories, right, that we've heard, all these different rumors, and the California rocker, which obviously came way later, or, you know, came shortly thereafter, but that's not what started it. Saying the Mongols couldn't get let in because they were Hispanic, which isn't true. There was already Hispanic members in the Hells Angels. So really getting this history out there. One of the questions I had for you too is we were talking about identity, and I know for a long time you were hanging out. You'd hang out with every club in California, essentially, right? Like you hung out with all of them. When you heard them talking about the war and you knew the truth, how hard was that for you? Like, A, it might have been dangerous, I assume, right, to say those are my parents, but B, like, how did that feel, like hearing about it and not being able to share what you know?
Well, that's what's really interesting about growing up in LA at the time, because like what we were sharing is there's an evolution. Like when that hit the fan with my dad and Bud and the clubs, they had never had a war of that magnitude, right?
Yeah.
And like George Christie said, they made the Mongols. The Mongols weren't that dangerous. The Mongols did all kinds of goofy shit back then to prospect guys, you know? That like, I've heard Little Dave and other guys sharing documentaries, like they'd get drunk and like, what would they do? Some weird, you know?
Junior had a lot of stories about that.
And with like something clenched between your butt cheeks. Yeah. And ain't no Pelican Bay Mexican, you know, Vadio gang member gonna do that.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, so they say the measure of a man is also the strength of his enemy, right? You know, and so when the Hells Angels were like, yeah, no, you're not going to do this and that, and they're blowing up funerals and warehouses and, you know, and shooting up and, you know, stabbings, and then the Mongols go, yeah, we're down for it, you know, and then they start recruiting and building up stronger, and, you know, and you know, I think there was a time they were even taking in prospects that didn't even have motorcycles.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So they're just showing up to bike swap meets and just deep, right? You know what I mean? And the HAs had more stricter rules, you know. But but that they had more numbers, and just that how it grew, right? And like even like from our point of view, being as anti-fascist, anti-racist skinheads, and then watching how the evolution of the Nazi skinhead culture went to where they ended up becoming like the soldiers of the AB and these guys in prison, and then they started joining the outlaw clubs. I mean, you're watching it escalate, the 70s. I was there for it, right? You were there for it. The 70s, the 80s, the 90s, then guys are going to both clubs are going in and they're putting in administrative segregation, right? Because there's green lights from this gang and that gang,
Yep.
Nobody saw that back in 74, right?
No way.
Yeah, it just became more complicated and more deadly. But I, as a tattoo artist, I started tattooing when I was like 16 years old. And my dad was still out in Malibu with Easy Riders. He got me my first tattoo equipment. I really needed money, that's why I started tattooing so young. But I left East LA where I would be more around the Vagos and Mongols, and I wouldn't never tell anybody. I remember one time when I met Terry the Wall, I got a call from my dad and he's like, "Oh, you met Terry the Tramp's son." It's like I would know right away when you show up on the radar and you're a real one and you're really connected to, it would always get back to you. Like you've been,
the world's connected.
They know, and this is before cell phones. They know who you are. They know where you are. They know,
Yeah.
And, my dad I was working at Fat George's Tattoo Gallery in La Puente, and I was under a lot of, actually George was like, "You can't work here." Cause I was like, people were calling the tattoo shop trying to buy guns to shoot me because I was like in these skinhead wars, And my dad told Mahoney he was afraid I was going to go to prison, and Mahoney agreed to take me on. And so then I ended up in West Hollywood, and he was going to mentor me, re-apprentice me. And I was in a whole different world, but I was closer to the SFE, my point being that then when Mahoney went to rehab, I went to work for Gilmani, and Gilmani was prospecting for the Hells Angels. And then boom, it's like I was prospecting for the Hells Angels,
I thought Gilmani was a Vago. He never was a Vago?
Before he was a Vago, he tried to join the Hells Angels.
Yeah, see, I didn't know that.
And then Bill Reed's coming around, and Bill Reed was one of my dad's buddies that they prospected with. And so you got to realize, for me, you show up on the scene and your dad's the editor of Easy Rider magazine. If someone finds out, if I could keep anybody from finding out, which I would a lot of the times, whether it be the Hells Angels or the Easy Riders thing, because a lot of people didn't like Easy Riders, or my dad, a lot of people didn't like my dad, and I'd been places and I would hear him talking about my dad, and I would just be like, because, he controlled the motorcycle industry through Easy Riders at the time. Like if your bike was featured, you became rich. My dad, Jesse James, got his TV show from Discovery Channel because my dad recommended him. And then my dad was on Monster Garage. But it was like he had a lot of power, and a lot of people didn't like him for various reasons. And in a lot of these places, I would be out of place, Mooch, right? If your dad's this wealthy guy and big shot, and what are you doing here with all these Mexicans? And what are you doing here? Your dad's a Hell's Angel. What the but so a lot of times, I was really under pressure to hide my identity, but there were times, like when I was working at Tattoo Mania, that like high-ranking Mongols would come up. Like we were open till 3, 4 in the morning on Sunset Boulevard after all the bars had closed, and Mongols would show up, and I would greet them like family. Because I knew them as family.
Right. Yeah. You grew up around it.
I knew how to walk between the Hells Angels and the Mongols. And treated them both like family. I tattooed on Bobby Loco all over his head, his ears. I remember he had MFFM on his ears. And he showed up one day and he said Ford Montavia was banging on him. He's like, I need to cover up this thing. And I put a little Mongol head on his earlobe over Ford Montevilla. So he kept the MF, and covered up the Ford Montevilla. And then there was, Lenny from East LA, and I put a big Mongol head on Lenny's neck, and it was all respect, no trouble. And then I would go to work on Hollywood Boulevard with Rick Clayton and Woody, Baby Ray. They knew who my dad was. Nothing but respect. I never felt like I was in any of harm's way. I rode a red chopper back then. I'd always have a red flannel on, had tanks done by cartoon,
Did they know the story of like how that? Were they aware of that?
I'll be honest with you, man. Those guys were so high on drugs.
Yeah,
I don't think anybody really cared, bro. That's what's funny, Mooch, right? They had their story and they were sticking to it. It was the bottom rocker. They were Mexican and they're white. Right?
Well, because it justifies it, right?
They didn't care. It was,
I talked about before with people is I was talking to a former Angel and he said one of his brother was killed by a Mongol. He said, my brother was killed by these cowards. And I said, honestly, dude, you can go to the other side and they're going to say the same thing, right? The thing is that both sides think they're justified in what they're doing, regardless of how it started, right? One, I can't believe we got disrespected. B, we're not going to be talked to like that, whatever. And they come up with a story that justifies what they're doing. Because if that makes sense, but no one's going to say years later, oh, this started over a personal beef, right? There has to have some big grand scheme for it, something they can feel passionate about. And I think one of the big changes with that, like you were saying, how it kind of shifted the scene, is the Mongols became a warrior club, a very regimented, structured, militant club. They were a party club, so to speak, right? But for an outlaw club. And I think it changed the whole game. But I'm happy to have you on, Frank. I definitely want to get more into this, but I want to cut this one short. We're going to do a couple other episodes about it. I definitely want to hear more about how this impacted you and even to this day. So we'll get into that. We'll have George on with you and kind of get his perspective too. So we're just kind of getting started with this, but I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. And we'll get back to it, brother.
Yeah, Mooch, thanks for having me on. And like I said, I just want to be a part of the movement. You're starting to, spread mental health,
Absolutely.
help, people get off drugs, help people that got ran over by the clubs.
Yeah.
That have been guys have been put out bad after, decades of loyalty, that are trying to find purpose in their life again. I just want to try to, I have crazy stories, war stories. Everybody's got war stories, but if we can do something that will build up towards helping other people, be better people and live healthier lives and be more well-informed about what the gang life really has to offer, which I just want to add, I still respect active club members and people.
Absolutely.
I respect all walks of life. I don't think that I'm a better person because I'm sober today and I'm living that. This has just been my experience and this is where I'm at in the journey. And I still respect active gang members. I respect people who are sober. I respect people who aren't sober. We're just living two different journeys and on two different pages,
100%.
And so I don't ever want to come across as I'm holier than thou or, I don't favor any club over any club. I mean, I love my father. I've made peace with a lot of that. And my dad's team will always be the Hells Angels. And I respect a lot of those guys. And I'm not trying to put myself in a pinch between either club, saying who's better,
Absolutely.
Who's not, I mean, they're both very respectable clubs with a lot of, solid dudes, they're putting in work to, and I don't ever want to come across any type of way out of disrespect. This is just my experience and what I saw and what I know,
Yeah. And that's why I wanted to have you on today. It wasn't so you can get this big story across. I want to show the truth to it, but also the humanistic approach, right? How it affected you. But also for these guys we're trying to help, who better to come to from help than a guy that grew up in that world? You know both sides, you know the positives and negatives and ins and the outs. So I think you sharing your story is also opening the door for people to come to guys like us for help. So I appreciate having you on today. We'll definitely get more into it. And let's check in on the next one, brother. Thanks for coming out.
All right, Mooch. Thanks for having me, bro.
What's up, bro?
Love and respect. Yeah.